So again, Shantideva, who was an Indian scholar of the 8th century, he says, for example, if one is overcome by anger or any of the negative emotions, first thing to do is to become like a block of wood. In other words, don't react. You know, if somebody does something which upsets us, instead of immediately jumping in, pause. Take some deep breaths. And then try to be more skillful in the response, rather than immediately jumping in. Somebody does something which upsets us and then we're immediately angry and defensive and so forth. Hold back. Breathe. Allow a little space in there. And the opportunity, perhaps, for a more skillful response for the time being. He's going to talk much more about how people do bad things and how we should respond. But the first thing is to recognize that if something happens which we get upset about, that we are upset. Or if something very attractive comes, we immediately want to reach out to get it. And we have to just pause and think, is this beneficial or not beneficial? Is this response really going to accomplish our aims and create, you know, is this how an enlightened being would react? If one were really filled with love and compassion and wisdom, how would that person deal with this situation right now? We are not high-level bodhisattvas. Well, we are, but we don't know we are. So, of course, it is not always possible for us as very flawed human beings always to act how a high-level bodhisattva would act. But it doesn't hurt us to remind ourselves. And this is why these verses are very useful, because, for example, if somebody does something really bad, we can recite that verse to ourselves and remind ourselves that if we really had wisdom, we would not react negatively to something negative. All of this is a training. This is why it's called practice. As I said yesterday and say again and again and again, if we want to develop any skill, if we want to become a musician or a dancer or a sports person or any skill, we know we start at the beginning and we practice again and again and again, and we keep making, for example, if you're trying to learn, you know, the Veena, as we were talking about Saraswati, or the piano, or any instrument, you know, in the beginning, our fingers touch all the wrong keys, it sounds terrible, it's, oh, you know, and, you know, if at that moment we say, clearly I am not musical, I can't do this, then that's it. But if we say, well, if others have mastered this instrument, I also can master this instrument. It just takes time, patience, and perseverance. Then we will master that instrument. I had a friend, an Italian friend, and his fingers were sort of like this. But he loved music. And he wanted very much to learn to play an instrument. So he went, to piano teachers and violin teachers. And they looked at his hands and they said, really sorry, no way, you just cannot do it. And eventually he came to India and he went to Varanasi. And he met a sitar master, showed him his hands. And the sitar master looked at his hands and said, well, this is going to be an interesting challenge. Let's go. And he became a brilliant sitar player and started a school of Indian music in Italy. And many of the top musicians, when they come to Europe, they go and play also at his school. And he's a brilliant sitar player. The fact is that even if we start with really strong challenges and problems, we can, if we have the patience and the perseverance, we can overcome that. And in the end, they can even be an asset. But it doesn't happen instantaneously. And least of all, training our minds. Because our minds are very habituated to certain patternings. I mean, it's neurological. In our brains, we are wired with certain neural pathways. So when certain situations arise, then immediately the message goes from there to there, to wherever we are habituated, that particular kind of situation will evoke those kind of reactions in us. So therefore, if we are angry-minded, then that's the neural pathways which are going to light up. And for a long time, neuroscientists believed that that was part of our DNA, that we are genetically engineered. Some people were just naturally more short-tempered than others, or much more this, or much more that we were just, that's how we were. You can't change that. But then they started doing many experiments with ordinary people. They would get them all wired up, and then they would show them things, or engineer situations which would get them all upset, and then they would show, how that part of the brain lights up, which has to do with aggression and anger and so forth. And then they began teaching them loving kindness meditation, metta or maitri. And after only about 6 weeks, I mean, they weren't doing it all day long, they would come and volunteer to sit for an hour doing maitri. Then when they tested them again, they themselves were amazed that when these same kind of situations, challenging situations came to them, instead of getting that neural pathway which they had before lighting up, a whole different part of the brain lit up, which had to do with empathy and kindness and compassion. And they themselves were just amazed, because they couldn't believe in such a short time it would have such an enormous effect on the brain that it changed the neural pathways. And so this is what they understood then, was that our neural pathways are not all carved in stone. They're actually very plastic. And it's more like, if you consider like a forest, and we're walking through a forest, and then we're trying to get from here to there, and we keep walking that way. At first, it's just a little pathway. But gradually, because we keep walking in that direction, then we end up making a whole road. And maybe it becomes a 6-line highway. But if we determine that we are not going to walk on that road, we're going to walk on a different path, then at first, again, we walk on that path and then there's no trace. But if we keep walking on that path again and again, then in fact it ends up being a road And meantime, that bigger road, that old road, the weeds and all the plants start growing up through it, and all the vegetation takes over, and it falls into disuse. And now we have a new road. And this is what they discovered, that it's not true we cannot change. It takes effort and determination. And the earlier we start, obviously, the better. But even adult people, very set in their ways, if they are determined, can change. So this is why it's so important to get to know what our mind is doing and the habitual places that the mind dwells in. All of us have comfort zones in our mind. And they could be skillful or unskillful. Many people spend a lot of time thinking of the past, of things people did against them, or things they did against other people, and endlessly churning it up and churning it up. Recently, I received this letter from this lady. She writes me from time to time, pages of it, about this crooked lawyer who had taken her house, and now she didn't have a house to live in. She only could live in a caravan, and on, page after page of all the awful things he had done. And then it turned out this had happened 30 years ago. But she had got stuck there. She couldn't move on. So she was endlessly replaying. It's like a soap opera, you know, you just keep replaying and replaying the same scenes over and over, and you can't let go, even when they're painful scenes. It's very important to understand that our sense of self, our ego, is perfectly happy to be miserable. Don't think that the ego wants to be happy. The ego just wants to be. And if it gives it a sense of importance by replaying sad things, then it will be perfectly happy to sit there feeling sorry for itself, full of self-pity. This is why, you know, especially in America, psychiatrists are so popular. You know, you go to a psychotherapist, you sit there, and you talk about me, and all the horrible things which happened to me, especially in my childhood, and how nobody loves me because I'm so special. And then you pay. I mean, nobody's going to listen to all this drivel if you're not paying them. But the point is that even though it takes time to dissolve the ego and be liberated, nonetheless we can have a happy ego. It is very important that our sense of self, while we have one, which we do until we're extremely spiritually advanced, should be well balanced and healthy. Because a healthy ego is not thinking of itself so much. It's much more concerned with others. It's only when our sense of self is injured that we are endlessly thinking me. So people who are psychiatrically disturbed are always talking about themselves. And if you try to tell them about anybody else's problems, they're not interested in other people's problems. It's my problems that matter. People who are psychologically healthy are able to reach out and care for the problems of others. And their own problems are then put in perspective. It's like if we have an injured limb. If our arm is injured, we've broken our arm or it's in pain, then we have to protect it and we can't use it. But we're protecting it and thinking about it the whole time. And if somebody, you know, hits against it, ow, whoa, my poor arm, my poor arm. But when our arm heals, then not only can we make use of it, a hand is very useful, but also we're not thinking about it. You know, how many of you are sitting here thinking about your arm? Right? Because, you know, it's healthy. So it's very useful, but we're not thinking about it unless we need it. And if somebody hits it, ouch, but then it's forgotten. So this is what we need to do, is to really also, along with this idea of putting others as most important than ourselves, not from a sense of self-worthlessness. It's not about making us think that we're no use and we're no good, and other people therefore are so much better, and I'm useless, I've never done anything right, I'm hopeless, I'm this, I'm that. That is also ego. That's why I said pride is not only thinking we're better than others, but also thinking we're worse, we're inferior. It doesn't mean that kind of inferior. As I say, what it means is just that we're not so important, it's not so interesting. Other people are fascinating. That's what it's talking about, that we appreciate others and are not just using others to reflect back our own self-appreciation. One time again, His Holiness Dalai Lama was at this meeting of eminent neurologists and psychiatrists. He has these mind and science meetings every year. And so he was going through some Lojong text, obviously, and talking about this whole question of the self-cherishing mind. That means a mind which is always caught up in our own self-concerns and is not interested in other people's problems. It's all me. So this self-cherishing mind is considered to be the root of so many of our problems. And so he was going on about how we have to uproot this self-cherishing mind. And so one of these eminent psychiatrists and neurologists said, yes, but what about low self-esteem? And His Holiness looked sort of blank and said, what? And they said, well, low self-esteem. This is high self-esteem. What about low self-esteem? And he didn't know really what they were talking about. So he asked his translator, what's he going on about? And the translator kind of translated that into whatever the equivalent Tibetan might be, or maybe he made it up. And His Holiness thought, and then he said, oh, I think very rare, very rare. And so then this eminent neurologist turned to all his eminent colleagues and said, who ever suffers from low self-esteem and self-hatred? And they all put their hands up. And so I think for His Holiness that was a breakthrough in understanding Western psychology. Because so many people who outwardly appear very confident and know all, once you take off that layer, they have all this self-doubt, low sense of purpose, meaninglessness of their lives, and so forth. It's very interesting because outwardly the West portrays this tremendous confidence. But inside they're very non-confident. And often Asians who appear much less confident actually within themselves have a sense of inner dignity, put it that way. And so what it's dealing with is not to make us feel worthless. It's not doing that. What it's dealing with is trying to understand how just as we are meaningful to ourselves, all beings are meaningful to themselves, and we should respect that. And therefore reach out to them and understand when our mind is dealing with running around in all these unhealthy mental states. As I say, like remembering things in the past which are not useful, or getting anxious and lots of worries and fears for the future when the future hasn't even come yet. And in that way, unable to deal with the present moment because it's crowded out by all these other fears in the past. The sense of self, the ego only lives in the past and the future. It actually cannot live in the bare present. If we are genuinely in the moment, not thinking about the moment or comparing it or analyzing it, but just being totally present, then at that moment it is a whole different level of consciousness. It's not our ego. But as soon as we go back into the past or the future and that kind of consciousness, then the ego is again taking charge. So therefore, we should look at our mind, because if our mind is filled with anger or aversion or pity or fear or jealousy or greed, then that will create not only unrest inside our minds, but will also eventuate in very unskillful relationships through our speech and our body. And so we need to know what's going on in the mind, not judging ourselves or beating ourselves up, but knowing it, and then thinking, if it's negative, how can we change that? And if it's positive, then encouraging more. It's like keeping a garden, you know, you weed out and you water flowers. But if we are only always carried along by the flood of our thinking and our emotions, and we never step back and actually observe them, then we can get caught up in all sorts of very dangerous mind states, emotional states, without even recognizing that. We know we're not happy. We know there's some problems happening, but we don't know why. And so we always blame everybody else. And we don't recognize that the real solution lies within ourselves. We cannot change others. We're always very happy to tell other people what's wrong with them. And, you need to change. But, we cannot change others, but we can change ourselves. But first step is to know what's going on inside us, and then to make the determination to really look at the situation and see where there are negative feelings, that we can, work to replace them with positive feelings. If our mind is always filled with positive thoughts, then we will feel so much more at ease, and also be so much easier to live with. So verse 4 says, whenever I see ill-natured beings or those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds or suffering, I would cherish them as something rare, as though I had found a priceless treasure. So normally what we try to do is avoid anybody that is, in any way ill-natured, meaning they're aggressive, or they're not the kind of people you want to hang out with, and or people who have a lot of problems, who are overcome by their past karma, and so forth. We try to avoid people like that and just hang out with people that we find easy to be with. And the problem there is that we tend then to fool ourselves into thinking we're ever so much nicer people than maybe we really are, because it's very easy to be loving to people who are lovable. That doesn't really require much spiritual oomph. You know, if people are really nice and say and do all the things we want them to say and do, then naturally we think they're lovely. But what we need is to get some practice in dealing with people who do not do what we say we want them to say, who do not do what we want them to do, who are overcome by their own negativities. I mean, I would say it's not that you necessarily have to go out and look for them. They will come. But when they come, then how to deal skillfully, recognizing they are our teachers. They are going to teach us tremendous amounts if we open ourselves to knowing how to learn. As I said yesterday, it's like we can consider it like going to a gymnasium. If we go to a gymnasium and the trainer will look at us and say, okay, well, your arms are not bad, but your legs are really flabby. Right, so here's a machine which is going to really test your legs. And so then you get on your running machine or your bicycle machine or whatever, and you plow away. And if it's too easy, then you turn it up so that it's more challenging. Because we know that the more, if it's not impossible, the more challenging it is, the more we're going to end up with strong muscles. And so this is the point, is that the difficulties of life and the difficult people we meet with and the difficult situations, they are our instruments to toughen us up and make us stronger. In Buddhism, there are 26 different levels of heaven. Starting from the very sensuous realms, you know, it's sort of like where you have the wish-fulfilling tree, and so anything you want, you get, and of course you have bodies of light, so one never ages, never gets sick, it's all very pleasurable. I think in the very lowest realm, it's sort of, again, you get reborn with these 21 beautiful nymphs, presumably nice virgin nymphs. I wonder what the women do. I mean, could you imagine getting reborn with 21 young guys, you know, all there? I mean, I think that's a hell realm, not a heaven. But anyway, the point is that the lower heavens are very sensual. And then they go up, and then you get to the Brahma realms where the beings are androgynous. They're not male and they're not female. They're like angels. And then beyond that, just mind states. Very advanced meditative mind states where the mind completely merges with the universe and so forth and so forth. And then beyond consciousness and everything like that. And essentially, they are regarded as a spiritual dead end. Because when everything is so nice, there is no incentive to go beyond that. And once the karma, which has caused rebirth in one of these various realms, runs out, we come back again. It's still within samsara. We haven't got out from beyond the wheel. We're still trapped on that wheel. And the lower heavens in particular are regarded as very tricky because, you know, as we are all very beautiful, everybody's beautiful, it's all very pleasant, even the words sickness and death are not heard, there is not the incentive. People think they're lasting forever, and there's no prick to get us actually exercising, right? So we become spiritually very, very flabby. And if you can imagine living for such an extended period of time in a body of light, and then you know ahead of time that you are now going to have to go down, that your karma is finishing, the body begins to perspire and the flowers you're wearing begin to wither, etc., signs, and all the other gods stand away from you. And then you know, even if you're going to come back as a human, you're going to have to spend 9 months in a womb after having spent such a long time in a body of light. Now suddenly you're going to be caught in this tiny little womb, all compressed. And it's terrifying. It's said that the suffering of the deities, when they recognize they're going to have to go, is greater than the beings in the hell realms. Their anguish, because they can't do anything about it, but they can foresee it happening, and it happens slowly, slowly, and finally they lose consciousness and get reborn in a womb. So why am I talking about that? Oh yes, because if then we get born into lower realms, also the suffering there is so endless, really, and the intelligence that goes along with it, that it's very hard for us to practice on a spiritual path. But the human realm is considered perfect because it has this mixture of nice things happening and also difficult things happening. And in this way, you know, the nice things help to sustain us and keep us going, you know. I mean, Buddhism isn't saying that every single thing is just suffering. It's just saying that there's this underlying dis-ease there. The surface might look okay, but underneath we have problems, because we're all going to get, if we don't die beforehand, we're all going to get old, we're going to get sick, we're going to die. What have we done with our life? But the thing is that the human life nonetheless, especially a well-endowed human life, not any old human life, but all of you have well-endowed human lives right now. Meaning that, first of all, you are affluent enough that you don't have to worry whether you're going to have a next meal or not. So you can give your thought and your attention to something beyond merely surviving. You are all well educated. And in this world, especially for women, this is still rare. It means you can pick up this text and you not only can read the words, you understand it. That is still so rare in this world. You live in a country where you are allowed to think and believe what you want. And I mean, nowadays, especially in India, this is being very heavily discussed and challenged and fought for, the freedom to think and believe what you want. That this is one of the things with its spiritual traditions that makes India so special in the world. And it's something which definitely should be guarded. That you have that freedom to believe or not believe as you wish. And you have the teachers are here. You know, in all the different religious systems and traditions, there are still teachers. You can find them, you can learn, you can practice. That is what makes a precious life, a precious human life. So this is something still in this world quite rare. And if we don't make use of it, then next time who knows where we will be reborn. Because we cannot assume that we're just going to carry on in the same kind of status that we have now. If we don't make use of it spiritually to really benefit both ourselves and to benefit others, then we are not creating the causes and conditions to come back and enjoy this again. All of you are here as a result of something which you did, all the causes and conditions which you yourselves have created. Even that you're here just listening to a Buddhist talk, even if you think it's a bunch of nonsense, nonetheless, the fact that you're here is due to causes and conditions, which you yourselves have created. So if we want such conditions to continue, we ourselves have to continually create the causes for that. Things don't just happen out of nothing. And so we shouldn't always think that we need to make this human realm into a deva realm. That's what I was trying to say. That actually, from a spiritual point of view, the deva realm is disadvantaged. And that our human realm, with its challenges and its difficulties, as well as the nice things which happen to us, are what make this human life so precious. We always want to choose the comfortable option, but sometimes that is not what's best for us. Just like if we're always lying on the sofa watching television, that might or might not be pleasant, but you know, physically it's disastrous. And we know that, so we go to the gym to exercise, to counterbalance that. And likewise in our life, when we meet with difficult people and difficult circumstances, instead of seeing that as the result of our bad karma or as an obstacle to our practice, we can recognize that actually this is a gift for us to really now begin to practice properly, not just fair weather practitioners. When everything is nice, then we're good practitioners. As soon as things go wrong, we drop the whole thing. Then that's not genuine practice at all. Many years ago, after I had left living up in the Himalayas, I went down to Tamil Nadu on pilgrimage. And we met this astrologer. And my friend was asking various questions of the astrologer. So I thought, oh well, as we're here. So I said, okay, I have two choices. Either I can go back into retreat, or I could start a nunnery. What should I do? So he looked up and did all his computations. And then he said, well, if you go back into retreat, very peaceful, very nice, very pleasant, very good. If you start a nunnery, many problems, many conflicts, many difficulties. But both are good, so you choose. So I thought, oh right, back into retreat. Always choose the comfort zone. And then I met with this Catholic priest, and so I told him, and he said, well, of course you start the nunnery. He said, we are like pieces of rough wood. And if we're always rubbing ourselves with silk and velvet, it's very nice, but we don't become smooth. In order to become smooth and shiny, we need sandpaper. So when you meet with people who are ill-natured and overcome by their kleshas, heavy with misdeeds, you can say, oh, thank you, my sandpaper. And sandpaper rubbing can make us very raw, but in the end, it makes us smooth. So this is a very important point. That often the people who create most problems for us in the bigger picture are our greatest spiritual teachers. As I said before, it doesn't mean that when we meet people who are trying to cheat us or who are abusive and so forth, we should just let them get away with it. But it does mean that it wakes us up, and we have to think how to deal with this situation and with this person skillfully. Not just, push button reaction. Not just getting all upset or angry or doing back to them what they've done to us. We don't need to do that. And also, sometimes, it just happens, that we have to... Dealing with difficult people is the way for us to inwardly grow up. Because otherwise, as I say, we become complacent. We consider ourselves much more nicer people than perhaps we really are. It's not that we're bad people when we get upset when people do bad things, but how to deal with situations in a way which does not create more conflict. So nowadays in the, at the UN and everything, they're having all these conflict resolution conferences. But for each one of us, we also have to deal with how to deal with conflict skillfully, so that it doesn't end up making more conflict. And when we meet with people who are difficult, that should put us on a red alert. Now we are going to think how to take this person or this situation onto the path and make use of it as an opportunity for us to gain inner understanding, inner strength, deeper compassion, while not by any means condoning what they are doing or ignoring what they are doing or pretending that what they're doing is all right in the ultimate view. Because just allowing people to get away with negative things is not often being kind, because then they will keep repeating the same mistakes. But nonetheless, it's our inner attitude. If we ourselves get angry and revengeful, then we are on their level. If we are dealing with somebody with a very negative mind, if that influences our mind to also likewise be negative, do you see what I'm saying? We are just plugging into that negative energy and creating more. So at that point, we should stop, pause, and if there is negative energy coming from that other person, to block it by not responding negatively and recognizing that this is the opportunity to put some of these practices into, to actually, all these words are very nice, but if we don't practice, then they just stay words. And so, apart from anything else, we should be grateful. Because if somebody who is very ill-natured and difficult brings out that ill nature and difficulty in ourselves, which otherwise we wouldn't see because the people are not, inciting that in us. So then instead of being angry with them for making us angry, we should be grateful because they're showing us a mirror to our own nature and what we need to work on. It's not a matter of changing them, we have to change ourselves. And unless somebody upsets us, we don't know that we are capable of being upset. If we're only with people who do and say what we want them to do and say, we think we're nice guys. And it's only when people do things which we don't want them to do and we get all upset and self-righteous. I know, I'm speaking of myself. That we recognize that there are whole areas which need to be worked on. And so then we're grateful. Thank you for showing me that, you know. Do you see? Because then everything which happens to us we can make use of. Everything is going to be helping us to deal with our own very untamed nature. We have to tame ourselves. We cannot train ourselves if we have not even tamed ourselves yet. So therefore, whenever I see ill-natured beings, all those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds and suffering, I will cherish them as something rare, as though I'd found a priceless treasure. Also, as they say, you know, the poor are not an obstacle for our generosity. So in, you know, Bombay, you have plenty to work on here, right? How much? Each one of us has to ask how much we are reaching out to help others less fortunate, those who are, as it says, overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds. Just a minute, what's the Tibetan? Okay. Yes, by heavy misdeeds and suffering. So, and then instead of dismissing them or ignoring them, we can recognize that they are helping us to extend our loving kindness, compassion, and care. We cannot solve all the problems of this planet, nor can we solve even all the problems of Bombay, or of your district, or of the apartment that you live in, or of your family. But we can extend ourselves to help what we can help. All of us can help more. All of us can reach out. We cannot solve the whole social problems, but we can do something to help someone. So instead of closing our eyes and our mind and thinking, oh, well, this is just all the result of your bad karma, which is not even necessarily true, we can think, well, in this situation, how can I help? And not treat people as though they don't exist. I mean, each of you are highly educated. Each of you have some social responsibility here. Who's going to do it if you don't? We cannot change the whole planet, but we can at least change a little bit in somebody's life. Isn't it? So therefore, when we meet with people who are difficult because of their nature, or are difficult because they have a difficult social situation, we, instead of being, you know, just cutting them away from our consciousness, we can think, in this situation, how can I help? In Taiwan, there is this organization called Tzu, which means loving kindness, Maitri. And it was started by this nun, this Chinese nun, Taiwanese nun, just a tiny little thing, very thin, very small, very humble. And she started this whole organization, which is now worldwide, especially among Chinese. It has millions and millions of followers. And they have built state-of-the-art hospitals, schools, orphanages, old age people's homes. And especially they go to disaster areas like, you know, where there are earthquakes and floods and things. Often the first people on the ground there are the Tzu-chi people. But one of the things she did two things, which I think were very interesting. First of all, when she first started, she was by herself, and she had her neighbors, these housewives. So she told them that every day they should have a glass jar and put in 50 cents. And at the end of the month, present her with these 15 Taiwanese dollars, like 50 paisa and then 15 rupees at the end of the month. And so they said, well, why can't we just give you the 15 rupees, you know, at the end of the month? Why do we every day have to put in 50 paisa? And she said, because it's training you to give. And so, you know, they were poor people, but they could afford 50 paisa. And so every day they put in their 50 paisa, and at the end of the month they presented her with the 15 rupees. And from that came this, you know, multi-zillion empire. The other thing she does is that, you know, wealthy businessmen and other affluent people, it's very easy to sign a check for a charity and feel good about yourself. But they do not accept money without the person donating it has to do something. So you get all these bankers and businessmen and politicians out there digging ditches, visiting the poor, taking care of babies, and so forth. All the different charitable organizations, they have to go out there and work. Then she will accept their money. Without that, they can't donate. And so, again, it changes their lives, because they never thought they could do that. But when they're actually interrelating with the people that they're you know, so easily just signing their signature for, and they recognize that they're people. And then, of course, you know, they're happy for people to do nice things for them, and then there comes this interrelationship, and then very much they join Tzu-chi and join the organization to donate a certain amount of time every week or every month for doing charitable work. So in that way, you know, I think it's very important for people. It changes their lives, and it's not impossible. So all of you can look around and see what's happening in your district that you could possibly, they're probably longing for some volunteers. So you don't have to give up your whole life or your lifestyle, but you can find somewhere, you know, that yesterday we visited an orphanage, and all these children from babies to 18 years old, some of them with, you know, handicapped needs, others perfectly normal but have been, you know, abandoned for various reasons and are now being taken care of. They long for volunteers just to come and play with the children and keep them clean and look after them. And there must be so many of these things, and if there isn't, then start something. You know, when we reach out beyond our comfort zones to recognize that there is so much need and we could help to fulfill that need, I'm sure you would find your lives more meaningful than merely just endlessly decorating your body and your houses for the sake of what? And going for kitty parties. If people find their lives don't have much meaning, then it's up to us to put meaning into it, isn't it? And the best way to put meaning into it is by reaching out to help others. So, therefore, he says, whenever I see ill-natured beings or those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds and suffering, I will cherish them. As though I'd found a priceless treasure, we don't have to discard them or ignore them. We have to recognize they are going to help us. They are going to help us to grow up. and stop being self-centered. Little children are often very selfish. We have to teach them how to share. Otherwise they don't learn and they grow up into being selfish adults. One time I was in England and I went to visit a couple I knew. They were Sufi actually. And they had this little boy who was about 3. And so someone had brought him a small box of chocolates. And he was just absolutely overwhelmed. He couldn't believe it. Nobody had ever actually bought him a whole box of chocolates for himself. So, like this. And so his mother said, or his father said to him, okay, now offer a chocolate to the nun. And the little boy said, no, they're mine. And his father said, yes, of course they're yours. That's why you can share them with others. And the little boy thought about that because he was only about 3. You could see his whole face, his whole body relax. Yes, they're mine, so I can share them with others. So then he undid the box and he insisted everybody in the room took a chocolate. He was so happy that they were sharing his chocolates. And I thought, that's a beautiful lesson to learn at that age. That we have things so we can share them with others. And so as we grow up, we have to remember these things, you know, and not end up like a selfish little child. It's mine and I'm not sharing it with anybody. Recently I read an article in the Times of India, I think. They had done a survey, a world survey, of whether children brought up in spiritual families of whatever tradition are more generous than children brought up in the secular. And they discovered no. Often children brought up in a secular household are more generous than those brought up in a spiritual, so-called religious household. Even though all the religions tell us we must be generous, but obviously they were copying their parents who really weren't generous. So if you want your children to grow up to be kind, generous, thoughtful children, you yourself have to be kind and generous and thoughtful. Because children, it's not your words but your actions which they're copying. And so if we want to give an example to children of how to be less selfish, how to be more considerate of others, how to be kind to everybody and not make so much discriminations, we ourselves have to set that example. And then for the children, they will come naturally. So that is also the responsibility of all parents. Not just educating your children, sending them to good schools, giving them good food and clothing, but ethically giving them good values. And as I say, children learn their values from watching their parents. Anyway, I think we are supposed to break for lunch now, and we will come back at 2. And then at that time also, we will finish these verses, and then if you have any questions, please write them out. They're going to give you little slips of paper, okay? We made them nice and small. And so at that time, at the end, we will deal with questions, if there are any. Okay? Thank you.